As you said, we're very warm welcome to this latest series of happy hours. In fact, I think we've held over 100 happy hours since the pandemic, and this is, I believe, our 11th series. So, real testament to how virtual networking has taken hold. But more about that later. We're very much focusing on fire safety and issues around fire prevention, fire safety in the housing setting, looking both at various technical issues, looking at various research as well as legal aspects. And we are joined by a stellar cast to cover both academia, practice, and the legal. And first of all, we're going to be joined by Professor Vikki McCall. Vikki's probably doesn't need much of an introduction to HousingLIN members. You've been a great friend and networker with us over the years, but probably this may be the first time that I can say you're now the Professor of Social Policy at the University of Stirling and doing some fabulous work there. And this is one of the programme we'll be talking about in terms of the ISPA project. She'll be followed by Naomi Crawford, Director at the Development Consultancy at PRP. PRP, a leading architects practice, award-winning architects practice. Only this month, I know they've won 2 mega awards, but also, Naomi, you've been very much working behind the scenes on some of the guidance and technical guidance, and a really important aspect in terms of the building and the architecture elements of safe housing. And last but not least, Ruth Sheret, a partner at a law practice, HCR Law. Really delighted that you could be with us here this afternoon. You bring lots of experience of working in the supported and specialist housing and residential care sector, and have experience around that in terms of guiding and advising clients of HCR Law. And we're delighted to start a new relationship with HCR Law this year. So thanks very much to you for joining. And then we'll have an opportunity for about 20 minutes or thereabouts for Q&A. So as Sally mentioned, do put any questions that you may have for Vikki, Naomi, Ruth, or indeed anybody, or all of us, in the Q&A box. And then we'll draw this to a close at 5 o'clock. Before we pass over to Vikki, can I also give a warm thanks to UKRI, who sponsor our Happy Hour series. So thanks very much to the team there. So Vikki, without further ado, let me pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and I'm very happy to be back at the Happy Hour. Oh, was that a terrible joke? I'm sure it's not the first time somebody has said it, but this is the first time that I've talked about fire safety. And although I've shared with members aspects of our ongoing work with ISPA, which is the Intersectional Stigma of Place-Based Ageing project, this is the first time that we're highlighting some of the findings from that in terms of fire safety, because what's been happening, this is a 5-year study and we're 3 years into it. And in fact, HousingLIN has just shared our 3-year celebration newsletter if people wanted to know more about the ISPA project. But what that means is that we're at year 3, we now have data to show, we have findings and analysis to share, which is very exciting. So one of the key themes that has come out of the ISPA project has been an overwhelming worry, negotiation and prioritisation of fire safety. And I suppose what I want to start this session with is the insights from the lived experience side of things in terms of fire safety, rather than maybe the practical, the technical, or the side of the law and regulation. So I think it's important sometimes to start with the people and the perspective of how this affects people in their homes. So what I'm going to present to you today is data from one of our work packages with my colleague, Professor Kim McKee. And the focus here will be actually people feeling trapped by safety, fire doors, accessibility, and indeed how this is wrapped up in terms of stigma and how we often design this into our home spaces. So overwhelmingly, fire trumps accessibility. This is a quote from one of our community peer researchers. We call them CPRs. We have around 140 older and or disabled people across Scotland, England and Wales at the moment who keep diaries for us, and they'll be keeping diaries for us over a 2-year period. So the data that I'm presenting to you are from these different types of diaries, and that's why I can give you these insights from lived experience. And I think this is really important because we sometimes talk about fire safety in terms of it being an isolated thing to fix. But what we maybe forget is that we're talking about fire safety in people's homes. And sometimes the fire safety elements and regulation, what we have to do there, overtakes other elements within the home that can sometimes be quite exclusionary and in fact discriminatory against certain groups. And I want to expand on that a little bit. One of the elements to this as well is the grounding and the contextualisation in the sphere of the housing sector, which is really dominated right now by debates post-Grenfell, quite rightly so. There have been snowball effects and ripple effects across the housing sector since Grenfell, which has prioritised and intensified our focus on fire safety. And however, what's maybe been forgotten, and I think is incredibly important, is the impact of Grenfell, for example, was disproportionately felt by those who were disabled people, and they were more likely to lose their lives because of it. And this brought a sharper focus, but also, I think, emerging tensions between fire safety and accessibility, of which I think the housing sector has taken up the fire safety element of that, but not the accessibility element of that debate. And I'm talking very, very practical things. The weight of doors, adaptations that are technical issues that override the fabric, and the technical issues override the living in that space. And what we've been seeing as well in this piece of work is clear knowledge gaps on the impact of this. And I want to delve into that in a bit more depth. If people haven't read the Peter Rapp's book, Show Me the Bodies, they really should. So if you really want to get to grips with fire safety and the implications and the historic setup that's led to Grenfell, and I would say look at Peter Rapp's book, because what he shows, it has been embedded in terms of what we could do and how we avert disasters. We could have averted some of these by listening to certain groups. And there's been a stigmatization that's been linked to social housing and sometimes to social housing tenants, which are incredibly unfair, but have affected certain groups more. And disabled people in this aspect have been and forgotten. They've been hidden and their voices have not been very heard. So this is one of the quotes here. I've always been disabled, so can people hear my dog barking? I hope not. Good. Ever since I've been disabled, ever since I was in school, I've experienced a fire alarm blaring and going to sit in a stairwell while everyone around me leaves for safety. I think this sets the scene well and how sometimes people think. As a child and a young person, I accepted it. I thought it was my lot. Like disabled people across the country, I sleep feeling anxious. I think that really sets in how people feel about fire safety, if maybe they have mobility challenges or other challenges in their lives, and that can happen to all of us as we go through our lives as well. So in this research, we wanted to balance in terms of the research looking at fire safety, but also with the lens of accessibility and security and how people feel. And we interviewed occupational therapists, architects, housing officers, building managers and surveyors across Scotland to delve into that expertise. We looked at interagency working, professional knowledge, external and organisational barriers. And we actually hope to report on this on the 5th of November, which we think is quite a good date, as you may guess, for sharing something around fire safety. So our data, what has it said? Well, we start to think of the day-to-day practicalities of people getting in and out of their homes and what that means in terms of fire safety, security, but how they actually do it, the physicality of it. So we have noticed in our data that people are affected by doors in communal areas, the front and internal doors in flats. We're seeing that doors are so heavy that they're getting pushed open by walking sticks. Doors close so quickly and so heavily that people are being hit by said doors. They need help from others because they're getting stuck. And the repercussions of that is people are wedging doors open, which causes fire risks because they can't open them, they can't use them in their day-to-day lives. And I think that's really important. There's a gap here in what we expect fire doors to do, stay shut, and be there, but actually the practicalities of it day to day are showing that it's disabling people and people can't use them as said on the tin, I suppose, is what we would say. Here's a little extract just to bring this alive. We're doing a focus group with people that are older and also maybe have different disabilities, and they're talking to each other here. It's like, have I showed you my bruises, didn't I? Your bruises? Yeah, coming through the doors, when they slam, when the doors hit you, you know what I mean? And when I come in, I catch it with my backside, and the doors do that to us as well. We had also examples of where automatic doors, we had wheelchair users, and they use, of course, automatic door situations where that mechanism has broken and they've been trapped in their house for 10 days. So there is a gap in what things should do and can do, but the reality of living with very heavy fire doors, of which we don't have very many good technical options to make more accessible, the reality is actually it's hurting people, it's trapping people in their spaces, and that's often a hidden thing, you know. So they're also quite stigmatizing by design, and people do not like this, right? The aesthetic on how homes look is obviously important. And this is how one occupational therapist has described it. While technically compliant, the way that we look at fire safety and accessibility is it's like a sea of buttons in a small residential hallway. People are pressing it here, and having to navigate and swim through this sea of buttons. Spaces start to feel medicalized and rather than homely. And adaptations may be rejected by residents who don't want them in their home, even if they need it, highlighting that design choices carry social and emotional weight, as well as practical consequences. So what this data is showing is that fire safety can be undermined when the design is not accessible. And I think that's an incredibly important point to make. So the research has found that it's creating barriers. It can be trapping people. The traditional fixed automatic door openers are not liked. You know, nobody thinks they're older. I've always made this point. Nobody wants a label or a stigmatizing flag that shouts, I need help. People reject that, as we all would. They don't want their homes looking like hospital waiting rooms. And one of the residents, you know, they think they just look horrible. They do not tend to, I think this quote says, oh, can you get them with a wee bit more discretion? And then we put our finger guards down and people are feeling trapped. They're getting their fingers trapped. You know, things like this are incredibly important. So when we're talking about fire safety, I suppose our data is showing we need to think about the people within it. And the technical solutions that are accepted at the moment are not often good looking. They're not thinking about it being a home. So, and there is a lot of uncertainty in the practice landscape. We've done lots of interviews with practitioners, and there doesn't seem to be a good set of options in terms of accessibility that's accepted or doesn't challenge the rules around fire safety. What we've found overall is a real lack of definitive answers around this. Inconsistent advice, people caught in loops about what is best to help in terms of accessibility. Professionals and OTs seem to be fighting their own corners a lot, and it takes a lot of time to resolve while people are still trapped, while people are still in these loops. And they favour different areas and different solutions, but there is no one accepted option. And at least the one accepted option is very expensive. It includes that sea of buttons. And that means that people are they're sidestepping. They're using other options that may be not as fire safe and maybe not as acceptable as well. So there are other wider challenges within this. There's technical and compliance and budgetary challenges. People are having to make retrospective adaptations for new builds due to design because of these challenges as well. You'll probably hear more from Naomi here. And we've seen what's happening here is people are having to replace fire doors, which is very expensive because of hard wiring door sets. You know, the minute somebody drills into a fire door, that's it, obsolete. But they maybe needed to do that because of accessibility reasons. And there's different funding pressures and priorities in the private housing market as well, especially in terms of multi-ownership. How is that negotiated? Very challenging. So we also see a lot of maintenance and breakdowns, specialist contractors that can give sometimes quite conflicting advice. And fire safety in one range of compliance measures isn't the same as others sometimes. And what we've found, I think quite worryingly, is that people might be in breach of building warrants while they've made these adaptations and they don't realise they're in breach of building warrants. We're a little bit scared we're opening a can of worms here with this data in different ways as well. It's a very challenging landscape. So to summarise, the case study that we hope to actually publish on the 5th of November is going to show that technical fixes for this are rarely straightforward. Professionals are facing a very confusing regulatory environment. It's a costly one. They're uncertain what adaptations are acceptable and not, and there's frequent tensions between different professional disciplines in the solutions around this. But the reality of that means that residents are often left waiting in inaccessible homes, sometimes forced to improvise unsafe solutions, such as wedging those fire doors open. So I don't think we're in the place we want to be in terms of fire safety and a tension between accessibility. So if safety is prioritised without equal regard for accessibility and allowing people to live the life they need to lead in their homes, we risk creating environments that exclude, stigmatise and endanger those we want to protect. And no one should be trapped by safety. We're going to be recommending that we need a multi-agency national forum to resolve these strategic issues, because everybody's grappling with this slightly independently within different organisations, and we've not had a big debate around these tensions, and we need clearer guidance. We need fire safety education and CPD embedded across housing, health and design professions, which considers accessibility and the people living in these homes, not just the fire safety and fabric issues. We need to also in that debate consider, are we breaching the Equalities Act when we're not doing this? Good practice exemplars of accessible and adapted fire doors need to be shared across the UK. Professionals are tearing their hair out right now in different bits across the housing sector. So we would love to see shared advice hubs that would reduce duplication and cost, but centering the residents' voices in this, centering design, inclusion, and actually reinforcing the key lesson that was in Grenfell. Those that are maybe classed as more vulnerable, I don't like that word, but certain groups, especially older and disabled people, were hit the hardest, but why aren't they prioritised the most when we're starting to talk about fire safety? So thank you very much, everyone. This is our Inclusive Alliance, all held up by the HousingLIN as well. And yeah, these are just some of the findings that we've been having from the ISPA project. But I would say this is one of the most important topics that's been coming out of the findings. Thank you so much for your time and letting me share our CPR's voices.
Vikki, thanks. Really, you're getting hearts and claps and love from many of our delegates, and deservedly so. A really great introduction, really thought-provoking, spoken both with passion, but also referring back to the evidence of what's coming through. And I was struck by a couple of things. One, this point around the equalities and discrimination, and we were really glad that you and Di and Dominique were able to write a little blog for us on the 30 years of the DDA, what's happened since, and that point about accessibility and generally, let alone around fire safety. And we really look forward to the further papers that are coming out. And I know on behalf of the HousingLIN, we're really honoured to host ISPA on the website. But you've set a real big challenge, I think, by those 5 sort of statements at the end, I think number 5 was the resident's voice. I think actually what you've described is that's the centre to a lot of this, and actually number 1. So you know, it's a really important point, and a number of the issues I'm sure we covered by Naomi and Ruth in their presentations, because you challenge some of the thinking, I think, both professionally, but also in terms of making sure we integrate and work across multi-agencies to think this has to be a holistic approach, not just one approach. And I know, Naomi, you're consulting, engaging with a broad range of stakeholders. So let's hear from you, and delighted that PRP could join us.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Vikki. Let me just share my slides. Okay. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining today. I am going to be talking today about future policy of fire safety design within care homes and specialised housing. By way of introduction, I am an architect and director at PRP. I've worked for many years within the later living team, and most recently within the development consultancy team, working alongside government, reviewing our building regulations and also fire safety matters. So, okay, so as a quick overview of what we will talk about today, first of all, I'm going to touch on fire safety policy and where we are today. And then I'm going to give a whistle-stop tour around some design considerations, starting with second stairs, moving on to evacuation lifts, mobility scooters, access decks, balconies, and finally sprinklers. So on all of these topics, the idea is just to give an overview in terms of current policy, guidance, and perhaps best practice. So I think, as Vikki covered, following the Grenfell tragedy, the government and the construction industry have worked really consistently to try and recast our building safety legislation. And by saying that, I don't just mean our building regulations. I'm talking about revised British standards, publicly available specifications, numerous briefing notes from fire safety bodies such as the NFCC, the London Fire Brigade. So I think initially much of this guidance was focused on high-rise residential dwellings, first because they clearly involve risk, and also because they're quite a well-established typology within our regulations. But since 2017, we have gone on to see updates on really numerous items, and I'm just going to put some examples up here. This isn't everything. So combustible materials, how we escape safely from buildings, so that includes fire doors, secure information boxes, how to fire risk external walls, sprinklers. Moving on from sprinklers, the government worked really hard to bring us the Building Safety Act, and along with that, the golden thread and a whole raft of further terminology such as responsible person, accountable person, PEEPs, etc. And then most recently, we have had second stairs legislation come forward under approved document B, and alongside this, revised British standards for evacuation lifts. So I think it's very evident, as Vikki said, that we're starting to get this increasing volume of guidance, I guess, to draw on. Unfortunately for the specialist housing sector, the guidance isn't always clear or comprehensive for many of the typologies within our sector. There's specifically a lack of clarity around the definitions used within specialist housing and how they would correlate when you're a designer or a design team to the purpose groups within the regs. And this, I think, can lead us to inconsistent compliance, a sense that we don't know how to comply always, and increasingly a heavy reliance on both fire engineers and fire engineering, which is, I guess, adding perhaps unnecessary costs to providing housing. So if we look at our first topic, second stairs, I think most of us probably are on top of this one, but from a year today, so the 30th of September 2026, all new residential buildings over 18 will require a second staircase for escape. And as we see density push forward in all typologies, and that includes specialised housing, I think this policy is perhaps more and more relevant for the sector, perhaps more so than maybe 5 or 7 years ago. So one item within our stair cores to watch is the provision of a refuge space, which is suggested in 9991, but not necessarily a requirement under ADB for specialised housing typologies. And it's just where we find these kind of grey areas that we start to become unsure. And refuges are really likely to be crucial as responsible persons put in place their evacuation plans for these buildings on occupation. Another item to watch just to future-proof buildings is stair tolerances in stair design. So if we consider a block of extra care apartments, for example, we often probably wouldn't design the stairs thinking that they would be used daily by residents. But it is worthwhile considering designing our stairs to the British standards rather than Part K, which provide us with increased going and reduced rises. Yes, the stairs will be slightly bigger, but it's potentially a very good way to future-proof our designs. So alongside second stairs, the London Plan in particular has highlighted the importance of evacuation lifts in recent years. And there are a number of other ongoing discussions on the matter. So over the last 30 years, I think we just said, the DDA and the Part HEM have improved how we access many of our buildings for many users. And I think now is the time where policy is really starting to prioritise and look not only at how people are getting in, but how we're going to get these people safely out. So most recently, the British guidance for evacuation lifts, the British standard was revised and reissued, I think, in July. And that looks at the lift provisions to ensure that disabled people can escape, hopefully, from buildings. It looks at what an evacuation lift requires. So in terms of if you have an evacuation lift within your current design or an existing building even, you need to be looking to think, do we genuinely have a dedicated secondary power supply? Is that power supply protected? Is our structure protected sufficiently in line with our fire strategy? And most importantly, do we have integrated communication systems to allow the people who will be using the evacuation lift in an emergency to operate safely? And then finally, we need to consider, do we have the trained personnel within these buildings to operate the lifts when they're required? And do we have dedicated evacuation strategies for those residents who need to use them? So our next topic is scooters. Scooters have, I think, are quite common in many of our retirement housing or housing with care models, where residents rely on them to get around independently, and they're a great benefit. However, there has been observations for the past few years that there is a potential fire risk. And I think the BRE have undertaken some experiments and demonstrated that a mobility scooter fire can spread easily due to the heat it hops from one to another, and also that the battery fire releases toxic fumes. So if we look to try and rely on 9991, there is some guidance in there, but predominantly on storage and charging, and stating that this shouldn't be done in corridors or common areas, but not a great amount of guidance in terms of how to store or operate. Similarly, ADB doesn't provide us any guidance on use, charging or storage. So the topic or the guidance to go for here is probably the NFCC mobility scooter guidance, though it is currently under review. It's quite a useful piece of guidance because it sets out looking at how to demarcate scooters in order to stop fire from leaping from one to the other, appropriate charging locations to stop people from being tripped up, the appropriate fire rating for walls in order to reflect the risk of how many scooters you have within a room. So now we're going to move on to access decks and balconies. And I think this has been a strong HAPPI principle for many years. And I think largely from what I see around current designs, a lot of the industry has caught up quite quickly in terms of best practice. And that would be reflecting the changes in ADB Volume 1 and not installing combustible decking. Many of our schemes specifically care homes, will have really quite large decks, which need to be non-combustible. And then similarly, it's important to use non-combustible materials on the soffit, especially if we've got stacking balconies where fire can leap up and up the building. Unfortunately, though, this is one of our kind of much loved schemes. I think the days really of winter gardens and potentially where we're seeing balconies that were full of a residents' belongings are potentially, we need to be keeping balconies definitely with non-combustible items on, or in some cases sterile, depending how the building is managed. And then our final item for today is sprinklers. So sprinklers were introduced into ADB in 2020 for buildings flats over 11 metres. And then more recently in 2025, they've become mandatory in care homes of any size. I think one of the issues that leaves us with is if you consider care homes, there's 15,000 care homes around the UK that have already been built. And from our research with government on this item, we learned that a lot of manufacturers and installers were actually reporting that sprinklers are increasingly installed retrospectively. It's a relatively manageable process once you tackle getting the tank in place, water, power supply. But in terms of installing a sprinkler system, even into a kind of a used care home, it's a relatively simple process. Where sprinklers can also come into play is if a fire risk appraisal of the external walls, so PAS 9980, has demonstrated that there's risk within the building, whether that's an absence of cavity barriers on the compartment lines, party lines, around windows. Sprinklers are a really good way of looking to manage the level of risk within the building. So as my final slide, I think in summary, I would very much agree with Vikki. I think we've got a lot of information now. We hear reports from a lot of designers saying that they actually feel quite overwhelmed by the amount of information, and that there isn't currently for our sector one clear route to compliance. And I think that's potentially where Part B is still just not quite there. But we know that the government are really working away and trying to look at this kind of landscape. There's hope, I think, that Part B will serve the sector better in the future. And just reading this quote, I think it's just very clear to say that we can't just rely just on building regs, and that we need to really refer to this increasing body of guidance and use it to manage risk for our residents and for our building users going forward. And that's everything from me. Oh, sorry, didn't skip me. And that's everything. Thanks a lot.
That's helpful to have that quote as well. I'll just leave it for a couple of seconds for people to read it.
Yeah, sorry. The interesting thing about the quote is it was actually before Grenfell. So yeah, this was kind of the voice around that time from the London Fire Brigade.
It's from National, yeah.
Okay.
But again, that was a really tour de force on sort of in such speedy time as well, in terms of the architectural side, drawing out the regulatory, the practice, and also some of the real issues in terms of when we're thinking about the architecture and beyond. So thanks ever so. You also talked about issues around not just new build but retrofit, and that may be something we may need to come back to, because much of our existing specialised stock and care home stock is already out there. So so again, that we have a big challenge not just for new build but our existing homes. And I think, Vikki, your work is also with people living in mainstream housing as well. So again, you sort of talk about adaptations and improvements there. So Ruth, thanks very much for staying on and waiting patiently for us. You've got, as I said earlier, a lot of experience working within the care home and the specialised housing sector as a practice, and you're going to sort of share about some of this through a legal lens. So over to you.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be speaking to you all today for the first time. I appreciate that you won't know who I am or where I'm from. So I should explain, the name HCR Law is a fairly recent name. You may be familiar with some of our founding firms, which is Harris & Clark in Worcester, Hewittsons in Northampton and Cambridge, and Rickaby's in Cheltenham. I mean, our roots go back to 1796, so we like to think we're an old law firm, but we have a brand new name. And so I'm keen that everybody understands that HCR was originally Harris and Clark Rickaby's, and that was a recent name, so we keep changing. But if I don't mention this, my marketing team will shoot me. I have to mention that we're an award-winning top 50 law firm. We've got 12 offices around the country, and obviously we're just a standard law firm. We do all sorts, business and personal stuff, so everything from corporate mergers and acquisitions to divorces and wills and conveyancing and stuff like that. So of course I don't do all that work. I'm a regulatory lawyer, which means that I advise on all sorts of regulations, laws which are dealt with in the criminal courts. So health and safety, fire safety, product safety, environmental issues, the sort of thing that we all encounter in some form or other every day. If there's an object, if there's an activity, there'll be a regulation attached to it somewhere. Now, I know everyone rolls their eyes when health and safety is mentioned, so I have to work hard to keep your attention today. But I thought it might be useful to talk to you about what happens when regulations are not followed. So, Sally, if you wouldn't mind going to the next screen, I'm the person that you call when it all goes horribly wrong. And I always say to clients at the end of my time with them, hopefully we'll never meet again, because I'm the worst distressed purchase you'll ever make, because the last thing you want to be doing is dealing with a regulatory lawyer. So as I appreciate that I'm talking to people who are dealing with the supported housing, specialised housing, the care sector, I thought I'd give you a bit of a war story about a recent case involving a fire safety investigation in a care home. So this was in a private nursing home. It was in a listed building. It had 3 floors, so it was, question mark whether it's over 11 metres. And it was first inspected by the CQC, who flagged some issues regarding fire safety. And you recall in June 2017, the CQC wrote to all care providers to encourage them to review their fire safety checks. And so funnily enough, after that, all the CQC inspections focused on fire safety. Because the CQC noticed some fire issues, they mentioned it to the local fire and rescue service, and the fire and rescue service then inspected. And they found failings like an out-of-date electrical installation condition report, inadequate compartmentation works, for example, the roof void that went across, the home was in sort of different blocks attached to each other, even though it was a listed building. The roof void didn't have sufficient compartmentation, didn't have enough emergency lighting, the fire alarm didn't have detection points in the roof void, lots of wood in the roof, all that kind of stuff. And the fire service said there was a need for better drills, fire evacuation drills. The owner did pay attention and did pay for some works, and some progress was made. But because it was a listed building, they had to liaise with the National Trust, and that caused some delay inevitably. And the works that the owner did just weren't enough to satisfy the fire and rescue service. So when the fire and rescue service wrote the letter of advice, they gave them a deadline by which to complete these works. When the owner encountered difficulties in getting the works done and sought an extension of time, the fire and rescue service just said, no, we're not going to give you an extension of time. And it was at that point that my firm was instructed. Now, we reviewed the fire risk assessment, and even as lawyers, we're not fire risk assessors, we could see it wasn't sufficient. So we suggested to the owner that an independent expert be instructed, and we decided it was sufficiently grave that we went right to the top and went to Colin Todd and Associates, who I'm sure you all know are kind of the fire safety experts. Colin Todd basically writes the government policy, he was involved in Grenfell, so on and so forth. So he runs a consultancy. We got one of their consultants to come out. And the first thing we did was institute a training programme for all the staff so that evacuation procedures were improved upon immediately. So even though there were lots of problems with the kind of fabric of the building, we were able to say to the fire and rescue service, look, even if it goes wrong tomorrow, we can get people out. So that kind of brought the level of concern down straight away. When we did this training, kind of persuaded the fire officer that we were taking it seriously and that he could breathe a bit more easily. We also established a very much separate dialogue with the fire and rescue service to that he'd had with the owner. Sometimes it's just helpful to have a kind of a third person in the mix. Nobody wants to pay for lawyers, but sometimes we actually earn our keep just by being that person a little bit aside, that you can have separate conversations with. The fire rescue service at the end was kind of ringing us first and saying, look, we're thinking of doing this, you know, can you have a word before we sort of gave us a kind of a bit of a hint in advance. And so the other thing I think that helped was that we appointed the expert with such gravitas that the fire rescue service were given pause for thought. So it just meant that the owner bought a bit more time and was able to fix some of the problems and head towards and put a programme in place that persuaded the fire officer ultimately to agree an extension of time for the completion of the works. We did start off with a meeting, you know, practical hints and tips here, a meeting with the fire rescue service right at the start. It costs money to instruct lawyers, but to have the lawyers in the room, the fire rescue service in the room, the expert in the room, the owners in the room, some of the care staff in the room, and we all said, look, we appreciate there's a problem here. We want to work together to fix it. We subtly dropped the hint that, you know, if the fire rescue service were thinking of just escalating this straight off the bat and not listening to us and issuing an enforcement notice, then obviously we'd be advising an appeal, which would put a hold on the enforcement notice. But we did this in a way that, you know, we want to fix this problem, but don't mess about with us. You know, he's got lawyers involved. But that, at least the upshot of that meeting was that ultimately we bought more time, and eventually the fire officer gave us an extension. We got a new fire risk assessment. We made the owner, kind of held the owner's feet to the flames and said, you've got to do these works, even though it's costing money. We tried to get hold of the National Trust. We did a lot of work. And eventually the case resolved itself for other reasons. But it was just one of those cases where actually what was required, some of it was pretty basic, such as not storing flammable materials like alcohol cleaners in circulation spaces. Now, one of the things I would emphasise is sometimes you don't need lots and lots of guidance and lots of expert input. Sometimes you just need the responsible person to take 5 minutes and actually think, what would happen? What could possibly cause a fire? What could go wrong when a fire starts? You know, what's going to cause it? What's going to add fuel to the flames? So having alcohol in the circulation space was just deranged as soon as somebody actually thought about it. So number one, it's basic. Do your fire risk assessment and then train your staff on it. Make sure they're trained and then review what your staff are doing. The other takeaway from that case, I would say, I'm afraid, is that the fact that the owner had to liaise with the National Trust because he was operating in a listed building did not matter one jot to the fire and rescue service. In fact, when it comes to the point where you've got a fire rescue service sending you letters of advice, and certainly by the time you get to enforcement, they're really not interested in your operational issues and the things that are stopping you doing the fire risk stuff properly. They are quite rightly only interested in fire safety and the risk posed to the residents in a nursing home. So moving on from that, one thing that both Vikki and Naomi mentioned is electric scooters being charged inside either care homes or in residential developments. One of my particular areas of interest, I'm afraid, at the moment is lithium-ion battery fires. I advise a lot of product manufacturers and advise a lot of workplaces on how to deal, product manufacturers on, how to make sure that these things don't blow up. And secondly, how to operate them safely in the workspace or in care homes and residential accommodation. Because while they are safe, and I stress that, there are thousands and thousands of batteries out there in so many different products, I am convinced that as there is a a move upwards in lithium-ion battery fires and in lithium-ion battery fire litigation. As at February this year, we'd had 10 deaths and 190 injuries reportedly sustained from lithium-ion battery fires in the UK in the last 5 years. So there's definitely an increase. More than half of UK's businesses surveyed recently had experienced an incident involving lithium-ion batteries. There's a manufacturer of fire safety equipment that puts out videos online. I won't mention the name because I'm sure I'm not supposed to advertise, and I have no interest in them financially at all. But they have a very good series of videos of batteries in like laptops and phones and scooters and e-bikes and what have you, just spontaneously combusting. Now this happens when the batteries and the casing is physically damaged or inappropriately charged or is subject to extreme temperatures. That renders the battery unstable, it renders the battery chemistry unstable, and these lithium-ion battery fires, they're different to normal fires. They're much, much quicker, much, much hotter, and almost impossible to put out with water. So I would emphasize safe use of lithium-ion batteries in any residential accommodation. And also at work, but we're talking about residential supported housing here. Make sure people understand the risk involved with using lithium-ion batteries, and then incorporate the use of lithium-ion batteries into your fire risk assessment. Make sure that the person who's doing the risk assessment understands the risk from lithium-ion batteries, and then just do your basic risk assessment. Where are you charging it? Where are you storing them? Keeping records of what's happening. How are you using and handling items with lithium-ion batteries in? Make sure that your workers know that if they drop something, just hand it in and don't just go and charge it again. Charging lithium-ion batteries, that's the majority of fires occur whilst lithium-ion batteries are being charged. So make sure that charging is done safely. And then, when it comes to disposing of them, don't just fling them in the normal rubbish, because a lot of lithium-ion battery fires are taking place in recycling centres, which I appreciate is away from your responsibilities. But if we're talking generally, we don't want fire anywhere. So I would include lithium-ion batteries in all fire risk assessments. Now, the other thing I was going to mention is fire prosecutions. Now, I appreciate, Sally, I forgot to tell you to forward on, but there's a next slide which has got the things I was going to talk about. But I don't know how many of you are aware of a recent fire prosecution involving Beechmere Retirement Village. I thought it might be useful to just explain what went on there, because, as I've said, when you have something goes wrong and you get the lawyers in and you're trying to work with a regulator, hopefully you can sort it out at an early stage and you don't get prosecuted. But sometimes the Fire and Rescue Service will take a prosecution, and that's what happened in Cheshire following the Beechmere Retirement Village fire, which took place back in August 2019, where 150 residents lost their homes and possessions in a massive fire. Now, Cheshire Fire and Rescue Service brought prosecutions under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. They had a long investigation. It took them 6 years to get to court. Now, I wasn't personally involved in this case. I've just spoken to people who are involved. But, imagine A, having a fire, and then B, the investigation goes on. Say you're one of the people involved in the situation itself, and you're under investigation for 6 years. It's a very long time. There's a lot of emotional trauma involved in that. So originally, 6 defendants were charged. 2 defendants were charged in October 2024, but had charges dropped against them in February this year. And that was a roofing contractor and somebody that had been contracted to produce a fire strategy 20 years ago. That's how far back the investigation went. Eventually, only 4 defendants went to trial, and they were Advantage Cheshire Limited, who were contracted to procure the design, build and finance of Beechmere and operate the village. Your Housing Limited, which employed the staff at Beechmere and was effectively the responsible person for fire safety. Morgan Sindall, which was the facilities manager subcontractor to Advantage. And then Total Fire Group, which had been contracted to carry out the fire risk assessments in August 2017 and August 2018 before the fire in the August 2019. So as I said, imagine you've been in the fire, you're waiting for a prosecution. So you wait 6 years for that. Imagine being investigated and you wait 6 years. Imagine the legal costs involved, the personnel costs of people being taken away from their day-to-day job to deal with the investigation or the prosecution. Imagine you're a resident waiting to see justice done. Now imagine how you feel when the whole trial collapsed on day 2. And this is the thing that I think you might be interested to hear, which is that the case collapsed because the fire and rescue service sought to bring its own evidence as expert evidence. And there are rules as to what evidence you can bring to litigation. And I'm not going to make you all into lawyers today, I appreciate. But the rules are basically you have fact evidence, which is just this happened on whichever day. And then you have expert evidence. And it's only when it's expert evidence can you produce an opinion to the court. Person that's dealing with just facts can't express an opinion. To be an expert, to express an opinion, you have to be an expert, obviously, but you have to be independent. And the problem with this case was that the experts that the prosecution sought to produce to court were its own employees. So the prosecutor and the experts weren't sufficiently separated. And so the defendants all argued that the experts weren't sufficiently independent and therefore their evidence should not be heard. Now, you can imagine Cheshire Fire and Rescue Service and their lawyers weren't very happy about that argument, and they fought valiantly in an initial hearing with the court to say, well, that's just nonsense. But eventually, on the evening of day 1, they went off and they thought again about it and thought, no, they're right. And so they had to abandon the whole prosecution. Now, Cheshire Fire Rescue Service say they only spent 153,000 on that prosecution. I can't see any prosecution going for that price. I'm not saying that they're liars, but I'm just saying that's a very cheap figure. I would expect to be spending hundreds of thousands on a trial like that. Once you deliver your briefing, you've got to pay it whether or not the barrister turns up. And barristers for a 10-week trial, remember it's listed for 10 weeks, they're going to charge a lot of money. So in terms of being a lawyer and dealing with things when they go wrong, it's sometimes the basic stuff that goes wrong, like getting your expert is the wrong, you haven't got sufficient independence, therefore they're not a proper expert. Getting the evidence wrong, that was pretty bad. So I'm trying to bring it all together for everybody because we've talked about a lot of things today. But the one thing I would say is that when you're dealing with things when it's gone wrong, you've got to try and reach out to the regulator who you're dealing with, but have some distance. But by the time they've sent you an enforcement notice, you're almost a lost cause. You're really fighting from the back foot. So the important thing is to not get there in the first place, to try and resolve matters, get your fire risk assessments right, get your design right, get your mobility scooters, being charged in the right place. Do everything right first off, please, and then you never need to see me again. I'm conscious I may have taken slightly more, so I'm going to shut up now, Jeremy.
Ruth, thanks very much. And I think what you've offered here was a real practical way of looking at this, and which I think the law was an adjunct to that, which also helps to develop an argument, but actually look at the practical issues as well. And that really sort of flowed on from Naomi's presentation and Vikki's presentation. So thank you very much. I really listened and learned a lot from that. We have gone on a little bit. We've got a few minutes for questions. I'm just going to go back into the Q&A box. And I know that there were one or two in there when I last looked. And in fact, there are 3 or 4 there now. So I'm going to just sort of start. And if it's okay with our guest speakers, we'll just ask them to perhaps stay on for a few minutes longer. I'm going to start off with Neil. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon, Neil. Listening to residents to provide homely, accessible accommodation may conflict with such things as sterile balconies. How may such challenges be mitigated? Using the word mitigation might be a word for Ruth, but I'm going to ask Naomi if she wants to just sort of kick off, because I think you had a scheme and a picture of Evington in Leicestershire, which I know well. So can I kick off with you first?
Yeah, we did. And I think I said it's a much loved scheme, and that I can definitely see that disconnect between. So we really prioritise providing outdoor space, balcony space, large spaces for our residents. And it is quite a kind of, it's very contradictory to then say, actually, you can only have some non-flammable items on there. Because I think you're probably well aware of photos in the past of really kind of well loved balconies that's got, you know, everything plus the kitchen sink on it. So yeah, it is quite a contradiction. And when I said the word sterile, I think I smiled slightly because I realised how yeah, it was very much against what Vikki was saying about, you know, personalising these spaces. So
thanks for that. That's a helpful one. We have a question from Kirsty about one issue we have in Scotland is there's no responsibility or advice for a safety risk assessment for mainstream housing. Scottish Fire and Rescue provide a safely home visit, however, they will not add to a risk assessment. This leaves our health and social care practitioners trying to ascertain risk around the fire door barriers, struggling to know where to go for advice on mitigations to avoid risk. Now, Ruth, I suspect the Scottish law and regulations are different to English and Welsh ones, but do you have any thoughts about this before I ask Vikki to say something?
I'm not insured to make any comment on Scottish law.
Oh, well, that's a very short response. In which case, I'll ask Vikki, and then Naomi, if you've got any thoughts on it, please do come in.
I was very black and white, Ruth. Yeah, no, the Scottish context is just backing up the data that we gather, just backs up exactly what Kirsty just said, that there's no actual solution. So what, and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service won't give one either. So where does that leave us? I think that's actually really, it's like we're all in a catch-22. Whatever solutions put forward and put in isn't the right solution then, you know, so that doesn't seem right. And I suppose, Naomi, just to add to your point, is the personalization of the space will happen anyway because people will live their lives. So solutions will never be the sterile balcony because people are going to put stuff on it. So we need to really think through and support all these regulations, but in a realistic way that, you know, because houses aren't boxes with no one in it. It'll be so it's, yeah, we have to really mitigate some of these elements by, if you make it accessible, design that is. Yeah, but the issue is nobody actually knows what to do best. That's really what our data has been showing. Yeah. So that means probably some disaster. Well, you know, we're not mitigating or finding this sweet spot yet.
And potentially you could have a sort of postcode lottery. Something works well one area, not in another area as well. So no, thanks very much for coming back on that. I'm just going to jump about with the questions a bit. Ruth, I mean, there's one here about if a fire risk assessment is conducted by a third-party company and their report states that everything is okay, but later a fire occurs and it found that issues covered or missed in the FRA contributed to the fire, who will be liable or prosecuted in this case?
Right. Number one, the prosecution would be against the responsible person, even if the responsible person relied on a third party, because the fire safety duty is non-delegable. So unfortunately, that person would be prosecuted. But in terms of liability, financial liability, they could then turn to the third party and say, you've done such a rubbish job, we've ended up being prosecuted, we want all our money back from you. Of course, that doesn't help if the person who's been prosecuted, in some instances, an individual can be sent to prison. They can never get that back from the third party. But in terms of the prosecution, the duty is always non-delegable, but actually the costs of it could be got back from the third party subject to the contract. And most fire risk assessors put a big thing in the bottom of, well, maybe not such a big thing, terms and conditions at the bottom, no responsibility, no liability, all that kind of stuff. So the lesson really is to get your fire risk assessment done by a proper fire risk assessor, so you never get into that situation.
And I think you sort of drew attention to some of that in one of those examples that you shared. We got two more questions. One from Shona that I'm going to cover. Our fire team recommend that scooters should be charged, and stored in a fire-protected scooter storage on the ground floor with external door. Registered providers of extra care schemes seem to have different views and interpret guidance differently. And she goes on to talk about space, etc. Naomi, any thoughts on that? And because I think you said there may be some guidance you're working on.
Yes, there is some guidance from the Mobility Scooter Association, and it says just that it talks about the fire rating which goes up if you've got more scooters, and that it has to be ground floor, externally accessible. So yes, it says exactly that.
Yeah, so you recognise it can be very tricky, coming back to the issues about how you compromise or not compromise between accessibility and fire safety as well.
Yeah, I think the issue with that type of guidance as well is it's not central. It's not. Most people would turn to ADB first of all, or 9991. So a lot of architects or designers are really having to kind of go down the trail almost to find the best and the most relevant guidance on a lot of these matters.
If I can just add something to that. The London Fire Brigade has issued some guidance on electric scooters and e-bikes that could be applied to electric mobility scooters as well. The London Fire Brigade has got a real problem with this e-bikes and e-scooters being stored in flats and hallways. And before, many people they live in London, they put their bike inside the hallway, they put it on charge, that's blocking the exit. So certainly it shouldn't be anywhere in a circulation space at all.
Yeah, that's useful. Actually, that may relate to Samantha's question, which is, can I ask, would a standalone property like a 3-bedroom house on a residential street, in this case, it looks like there may be some care package as well, would that fall within the remit of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, 20 years ago? Any thoughts on that, Ruth?
If it's a care home and it's got more than one person living in it, because did you say it's 3-bedroom house?
Yeah.
If it's like a small care home, then definitely, and there'd be the government guidance on the fire safety order care guidance. There's a special guidance for care homes. If it's a private home, then no.
Yeah.
So one person living in their own home having care brought in, but I suspect from the fact that it's a 3-bedroom house, it sounds like a small care, like a small specialised supported housing or something like that. And yes, it would.
Or HMO or something.
Well, HMOs is again different. Yes, they're fire risk assessed, obviously, and but it's not with the care thing. I would mention guidance for the care homes aspect.
Well, that's very helpful in terms of clarifying the differences then between HMOs, somebody's private residence, and perhaps a specialised housing scheme as well. Yeah. Well, look, wonderful questions. Michelle says her boss rang and she was on the phone for 15 minutes. Well, please tell your boss off, but and ask him to come and join us at a future happy hour. But yes, Sally will be making the slides and the recording available and the chat that's taken place during this week, and we'll be again publicising that both through our socials as well as in our newsletter on Monday. It comes out on Mondays. But on behalf of the HousingLIN, can I thank all our 3 excellent speakers. What a fantastic happy hour we've had for you. One of you, I think Ruth, mentioned alcohol. Well, I can't offer you a happy hour alcoholic drink, but I hope you can have a cup of tea or something before you have more refreshments this afternoon. If this is the first time you joined us for one of our happy hours, we normally run these on every Tuesday at about 4 o'clock. And next week we're looking at Arms House Reimagined with a really exciting scheme that Vikki knows really well, Appleby Blue down in Bermondsey. So if you want to come and learn a bit more, not just about the physical architecture, but the social architecture and what happens at a community resort, do join us when we'll be joined by the team from United St Saviour's and others. So on behalf of the HousingLIN, Sally, thanks for your help and the team behind the scenes. It's been a great session, a wonderful way to kick off this series, and apologies that we've overrun by 5 minutes or so, but I hope you thought it was worth it. Thanks a lot.